Not too bad. Got my screen set up here.
So we're what?
Set ready to roll.
Yeah. Well, we're doing a reaction, or not a reaction, but just on the topic of if God exists, why is there suffering? And Dalton came across this video about a week ago, and it's kind of funny because I was sitting in church that Sunday, like literally the day before he sent this video over, and he was talking about like if God exists, why is he allow bad things to happen to good people or just bad things in general? And so it was fresh on my mind, which kind of worked out. But anyways, yeah, good timing.
Yeah, it's a question that's asked frequently. A lot of people don't have the answer, so here we'll answer it again.
Yeah. Well, here is the also share tab audio. Here we go. Here's the video. Just a little clip, good clip. Start it out.
If God exists, how do you explain suffering? Like, what is the reason for suffering?
And I think that's the most difficult question for me as a follower of Christ. The question, bluntly put, is if God's so loving and if God's so powerful, then why is there so much suffering? Ultimately, I do not know why God allowed evil, suffering, and death, because Jesus never gives us the answer to that question. But as a Christian, I have to think. First point, Genesis records how when God created, he did a good job. In other words, God did not create evil, suffering, and death. But in Genesis chapter 3, we read how human beings exercised their free will in an irresponsible, illegitimate way and created evil. And then as a result of the evil that we create, all types of suffering follows.
If God exists, how do you explain suffering?
That was a good answer.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the hardest, I feel like, for people to grasp a hold of, as they kind of cause their own suffering. That's definitely something that it's like a self-reflection kind of deal that isn't always pleasant.
Yeah.
But
well, the question, yeah, in that service that I was at, he's like, yeah, if God exists, why would he allow bad things to happen? And the answer was free will, essentially. That's it. Is because like if he even intervened slightly, he'd be going back on his own commandment or his own promise of, this is your decisions,
free
right?
will.
Yeah.
It's kind of, and some people always ask, like, if he, well, why can't he just intervene? And like a lot of times he does intervene and we ignore him. And then other times it's like, well, he still gave us free will. And the way I like to explain it to people is like, if you have a kid or a child, or you have somebody that you care about, are you going to lock them up in a padded room and never let them leave? Because that's what you're asking God to do for you, is lock you up in a padded room and not let you leave. Because you'll eventually, because he gave you free will and the ability to think, you'll eventually end up hurting yourself. And so, but he gave us free will. He gave us the option to make our own choices, which can either be a positive or have positive or negative consequences.
Yeah, and with God, it's like it's black and white, right? It's like if he were to even slightly step in and intervene, then he would be going back on his word, and that he'd be breaking his, principle, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously okay for him to step in and intervene in some areas. As he's done in the Old Testament. You read through the Old Testament, and sometimes he steps in and intervenes. And he allows people to not suffer because they repented. And so I think there's more answers than just free will of like why suffering and pain. Like, obviously, I think free will started it. I think our free will started the suffering and pain, and through free will of and through people's mistakes, God has found ways to make suffering and pain beneficial to man.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
And so,
Yeah, I guess I've kind of thrown out a lot of the rest of scripture at that point, because he does influence things.
yeah, he most certainly does. I mean, he says that he sends us through testing and trials. And well, one thing is like there's a biblical verse, and I think it's right here, as one is testing and trials. The Bible portrays suffering as a means of testing and refining individuals and faith and character. And in James chapter 1, verse 2 and 4, it says, "My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." Suffering can serve as a crucible for spiritual growth, resilience, and a deeper reliance on God, which that last part's really important because a lot of times, like, we suffer mentally and we suffer too much because we don't have a deep reliance on God. And one of the ways I like to read this, and if you have a dictionary at home, you can look this up. I use the Webster's 1828 dictionary. It's my favorite dictionary. Yes, I have a favorite dictionary. But the word patience is an interesting word because the first two words the first two words in the definition of patience is the suffering. Those are the first two words in the definition of patience, and so it's not 100% interchangeable word, but in context you could swap it out. The trying of your faith worketh suffering, but let suffering have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. And so that word patience, and it's going to be used further throughout. But actually, I'm going to pull that up real quick. Do you have any thoughts on
that? Well, I'm here learning with you, man. So
I gotcha. No, the definition here in the Webster's 1828 is the suffering of afflictions, pain, toil, calamity, provocation, or other evil, with a calm, unruffled temper, endurance without murmuring or fretfulness. And so, pretty good definition of patience, because I think a lot of times when we think of patience, we think of just waiting, just kind of sitting and waiting. We don't really consider it like a mental battle, other than, you're just waiting on somebody, and that's really not 100% what patience is.
Yeah, we always seem to come back to that word patience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the other thoughts is Jesus on the cross. Is like there was a lot of pain and suffering there, and so that God sent His Son through. So the Christian faith teaches that God's ultimate plan includes the redemption and salvation of humanity, and so the suffering of Jesus Christ on the cross is seen as a very good example of suffering, offering hope and forgiveness to those who believe. In Romans 5, chapter 3, and verse 5, it states, "And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope, and hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given unto us." And I'm going to read it one again because I just love reading it this way. "But knowing that tribulations worketh suffering, and suffering experience, and experience hope." And I don't want to like point it too much like every single thing that you have to learn should involve suffering and pain. because I think you should be able to learn and it not be painful or suffering, and then be able to go throughout life, avoiding that particular thing that could cause suffering and pain.
Yeah. Well, I guess learning anything, right, is uncomfortable for the most part, or at least growing past where you're at now, because it takes a little bit of discomfort to step out and admit you don't know anything, be a beginner, So it is necessary.
Yeah, certainly. And just, like me when I was younger and I was first starting to read my Bible, it was like that was the most painful thing, like mentally, for me to read through the Old Testament. It's just like exhausting. And so like, but there's lots of information to grab a hold of in the Old Testament, and so many life principles that have probably kept me out of a lot of problems and probably kept a lot of friendships intact, because I knew those things. And so I knew how to address them when they came. And so it's kind of like a preparation. And so, but last one here that I have is God allows suffering and pain for greater purposes. And this one's hard because some things are just unanswered and we don't know. And so God's ways are often beyond human understanding. We don't quite grasp it. And maybe we won't grasp it until we get to heaven and meet him and know him for a long time after we get to heaven to understand certain things and certain sufferings and pains. But in Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. There's like some really good explanations of this, examples of this in the Bible. And like one is with Joseph in the coat of many colors. His entire life, almost a majority of his life, is just suffering and pain and basically just wrongdoing towards him his entire life. Like his family betrays him, his brothers betray him, they're going to kill him. One of his brothers decides, nah, let's not kill him, but let's sell him instead as a slave. And he'll go to these, but not only sell him as a slave, but sell him to a slave to people that don't align with idea, period. So he's not just being sold as a slave, he's being tossed into a whole nother culture of people that have nothing in common. And so he goes through an entire life of slavery. He finally starts to rise to the top just to be crushed back down to the very bottom again, and then rises back to the top. And all of that suffering and pain, which in the Bible it does claim that I don't think it states anywhere in the Bible where it says that Joseph complained or was frustrated. He definitely cried out to God. But Joseph would be a prime example of the word patience, and just understanding suffering and pain and what it can lead to. His faith in God, and obviously the reason his brothers were jealous was because he dreamed a dream and shared it with his father. And the dream was, that he was sitting on a throne and everybody was there before him, kneeling down before him, basically that they were at his mercy. And that's exactly what happened. You have another perfect example of Job. You read in the Bible, God's having a conversation with the devil, and the devil basically states, hey, here's your servant, but he's only your servant because you're so good to him and you protect him, and you've just basically babied him his entire life. Let him suffer a little bit, and I promise to you that he'll betray you and spit in your face. So God's like, okay, yeah, go ahead, test him, try him. And you see through that the devil takes everything from him. He takes his health, he takes his children, he takes his wife. You could argue that he even took his friends because he had nobody there to basically tell him that what he was doing was right. And another interesting thing about this story is that Job falls down before God and cries, and he thinks that he's done something wrong. Job is like, oh crap, I did something wrong. I don't know what I did, but why is God raining this judgment on me? And God just kind of, from the way I remember reading this story, it's been a while since I read back through Job. He kind of just like leaves him in the dark for a little bit. He doesn't like respond to him for a while. He's there. Don't mistake me. He's there and he's present with him. And he kept him safe because he said, Satan, you're not going to take his life. Leave him alive. And after all of this, he didn't deny God. He didn't deny the existence of God. He kept believing in God. And he told his friends to, screw off. Like, I'm with this guy, regardless whether you guys are not. And that was really the only friend that he had. But God came back and he blessed him again after it because he didn't fall apart. And so, but suffering and pain, it's like they have purposes, they have roles. And I think in a lot of different areas in life, we can actually look at suffering and we can look at pain and make a decision of whether we want it to help us grow or whether we want it to help us to fall into despair.
Yeah, that's interesting because with those two people, like there wasn't a step-by-step plan that was laid out for them. It just happened in that unknown. Like sure it sucked, but there was no plan that they knew of, right?
Right.
They just had to just be patient through it.
Yeah, they just had to be patient and live through it. And like, here's the last point I'll make, and I know this one will be I know this will be upsetting to some, but like if you look at Paul in the Bible in the New Testament, okay, he had a part in the death of a lot of Christians.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Christians that may have witnessed to him, come along and witnessed to him, or at least planted a seed. And then eventually at some point in time, he got saved and he repented. And then he became one of the most important people that dedicated his life to the Lord. And now 2,000 years, so many thousand years later, 100 years later, he is, he's still read. Notes that he wrote are still read, not only in the language that he wrote them, but also in several different languages. And so it's quite amazing. Like some of us think that our lives are so simple that we're not really anything because our name hasn't been, lifted up like Paul in the Bible. His name was recorded. Here's another thing I said is like Billy Graham. It's like everybody knows who Billy Graham is. It's like great preacher, awesome guy, led hundreds of people to the Lord, great Christian, right? Led revivals, super encouraging guy. Everybody knows who he is. Mm-hmm. Everybody doesn't know the people that inspired him to be that. And so like your inspiration, not just your inspiration, but the person that led him to the Lord. Nobody knows his name, or at least I don't know of anybody that knows his name. That's not a name that's well known, but that person had a huge impact on the world. They changed one person's life, then that person went and changed millions, maybe millions of people's lives, inspired millions of people just because of a smaller action that was taken. And so sometimes us Christians, we suffer and we're ignored and we don't get the recognition, but it's still important to remember that the small things that we do still account for great things.
Right, yeah. Well, that's like a lot. No, you're on fire. It's like those people that like are in the background serving during church and all that. Like they don't get that recognition, but things couldn't run without them.
Oh yeah. It's like the guy that sits up behind the computer and runs live stream. It's like nobody hears him. It's like just quiet.
We'll never recognize Ryan in the back doing the controls. Oh, but yeah, that's a good point, man. Yeah, especially like the cooks. You know, do you recognize the cooks at camp that much?
Oh,
When
yeah.
it's like they're the ones that are keeping everything running. Really, they're the real
Yeah.
heroes of that there.
If they disappear, camp has to stop.
Right. So yeah, summer camp stops at that. So yeah,
Yeah.
good point. So let's recap here, man. We got free will, definitely at the top. Testing and trials is another one. Redemption and salvation. And go back to Romans 5:3-5 for that one. And to as the fourth, greater purpose. And you'll never know you're a part of a greater purpose, apparently. It'll just
Well,
happen
you
to
will.
you and you endure.
You will if you believe Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according
Right.
to his purpose.
You won't
Then
know
you
the
know.
step-by-step plan, but you'll
That's
know.
true. That's true, yeah.
Yeah.
You'll know that somebody does have a step-by-step plan.
It is not you.
They just haven't shared with you.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Well, that was a fun one. That was fun. I learned a lot, honestly.
was
So
blessed.
I sit here, just listen and think. So
oh, well, good. There we go.
all right. Well, catch y'all next week.